Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our second episode in the 2023 edition of the Resilience Advantage. We're so pleased to have you here today, and we're excited about our seminar that we have assembled for you. A great panel of experts to talk about how natural disasters like earthquakes impact small businesses in particular. And to that end, we're incredibly pleased this year to be co-sponsoring the Resilience Advantage series with the Small Business Administration. We are so pleased to have them as a partner this year to really bring to the Resilience Advantage a focus on how small businesses throughout seismic regions of the country can be more prepared for earthquakes. And that translates to other natural disasters too. And so we're so proud to have Julie Klaus, the district director of the Southern California region for the Small Business Administration, here with us. And I'll ask her in a minute to introduce herself. But again, a real thank you to the Small Business Administration in partnering with the U.S. Resiliency Council. The USRC is a nonprofit organization. We were started here in California about 11 years ago, and our purpose was to promote community and business resilience by advocating for design of buildings, new buildings, mitigation of existing buildings to make them better prepared to withstand earthquakes and other natural hazards. And you're going to be hearing today actually from an expert who's going to be talking about the recent events in Turkey, which obviously are on everybody's mind, and the tragedy that's unfolding there, and the lessons and important things we can learn in California, other seismic areas of the United States, and as small businesses uh, about our own vulnerability and opportunities in protecting ourselves from natural disasters. So the Resilience Advantage series started back in 2021, and we had a series of videos and panels, discussions like this, to educate stakeholders in the built environment. Those were owners and tenants, lenders, insurance companies, engineers, architects, about why resilience is important, how to make resilience part of your business, and why it's good business and why it's a win-win for everyone. And this year we decided we really wanted to focus in particular on the opportunities that small businesses have. Obviously, small businesses drive our entire economy. The majority of businesses in the United States are small businesses. There's a whole agency, the Small Business Administration, devoted to making sure small businesses in our nation thrive. But often, a lot of small businesses are at particular risk when it comes to natural hazards, whether they're earthquakes or hurricanes, floods, wildfires, and we've obviously seen evidence of this throughout the country over the past decades. And so, our goal through this series, through today's webinar and the upcoming webinars, all through 2023, is to give small business owners, small business leaders, real practical ways to make sure that their businesses survive and thrive after inevitable natural hazard events. So with that, we're going to start by showing you just a very short intro video to the Resilience Advantage series, and then we'll get started with our panel.
Welcome to the Resilience Advantage, a series brought to you by the U.S. Resiliency Council. I'm your host, Evan Reese, and we'll be exploring what resilience means to our communities in the face of natural disasters like earthquakes, hurricanes, floods, wildfire, and now even pandemics. The cycle of preparing for, responding to, and recovering from natural disasters is ongoing. Resilience is learning how to be better at each the next time disaster strikes. By working together now to become more resilient, we can protect our economy, investments, businesses, and our financial strength. We hope that you will join us on the journey towards a more resilient future.
Thank you. I hope you enjoyed that short video. You can also access, by the way, last year's Resilience Advantage series through the USRC website. All the videos that we produced and all of the webinar series with panelists are all there. And there's some great content. We also have a podcast called Making Resilience Cool, which you can find wherever you get your podcasts. And this podcast takes some of the interviews you will have seen in the Resilience Advantage series from last year and expands on them. Really gets into depth with experts in the field of building and engineering and architecture. So we'll hope you take advantage of that as well. Personally, I would like to take this opportunity to thank some of the partners of the U.S. Resiliency Council who have really helped us in all of our efforts to make the Resilience Advantage possible, to produce it, to help contribute great content. And those include the Los Angeles Area Chamber of Commerce. They've been a huge supporter of ours, and we've been very pleased to get to know them, along with the LA County Business Federation. And I'm so excited that we'll have Tracy Hernandez, the founding CEO of BizFed, here on our panel, and I'll introduce her in a minute. Also, the Los Angeles County Economic Development Corporation, and of course, this wouldn't be possible at all without Optimum Seismic, a sustaining member of the U.S. Resiliency Council, and just a deeply committed partner in making resilience widely accessible to Californians. So with that, I am going to start introducing our speakers. Some of them are still working to get the cameras working correctly, but we'll have them on in a second. Oh, and as we go through the panel discussion, though, I have some questions, obviously, to ask all of our panelists. But in the Q&A or the chat of the live YouTube stream, you'll be able to ask questions yourself, and we'll try and get to those as we can. So feel free to just type those in, and we'll try and get to as many as we can. But first, let me start with some introductions. Let me first start with Julie Klaus. She is the District Director of the Los Angeles Metropolitan Area of the Small Business Administration, and as I said, a great partner with the USRC in this Resilience Advantage series. We also have Tracy Hernandez, the founding CEO of LA BizFed, the Business Federation, in helping us get the word out and bringing her members, many of whom are small businesses, into the discussion around resilience. We have Dr. Ross Stein. He is the CEO and co-founder of Tembler. And he is going to talk today. He's a renowned scientist in seismology and earthquake engineering, and he's going to talk to us today a little bit about what's going on in Turkey and the lessons we can learn from that. And Ali Sahabi, who is the co-founder and the COO of Optimum Seismic, who's been also a great partner with me and the USRC, and he will bring his expertise as someone who builds buildings and retrofits buildings, many of them owned by small businesses in the Southern California and Northern California areas. So with that, we are going to start, and we are going to start by me not talking anymore, and I'm going to give our panelists a chance to introduce themselves. So I'd like to start with Julie. Please give us an introduction to yourself and the SBA and why it's so interested in resilience.
Thank you, Evan. Welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining us in this webinar series. As Evan had said, SBA has partnered with USRC in an effort to bring, you some additional education around resiliency, building your resilient small business. From the SBA, we've spent the last 2.5 years really helping small businesses to try to weather the pandemic and all of the challenges that brought. But that is not the only, quote, disaster that we are here to assist with. We are here, to support the small businesses, as we say, in good times and in bad. And I think that this is a great time to start talking about the lessons learned and what we can do and how we can help small businesses to build that resiliency within their business and do what they can so that, God forbid, another pandemic, or the other natural disasters that we know unfortunately are going to affect us at some point in time, that we have businesses that are going to be able to bounce back from whatever challenges are thrown their way and continue to survive and thrive beyond whatever that incident might be. So we're here, to support the businesses through financing, through government contracts, and through one-on-one business advising that is at no charge to our businesses. So thank you for joining today, and I look forward to the conversation with our panelists. And please continue to join our series with USRC, as we're going to talk about a lot of issues through the next many months. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. We're so pleased to be partnering with you. Tracy, please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about BizFed.
I'm happy to do so. I'm Tracy Hernandez, and BizFed. What is BizFed? It's the LA County Business Federation. And by the name, you might understand that it's basically a network of all the existing business networks into one united federation. So as of today, we have 235 different, distinct, unique business groups. So we have local city chambers of commerce, we have industry trade associations, minority business groups, women business groups, business improvement districts, you name it, all coalesce to share fast-moving intel wherever the government's going to impact a private employer here in California. Those business groups have 410,000 companies of every shape and size, every sector in Southern California, and they're employing 5 million people. So we're strengthening the voice of business, and the voice is needed on all aspects of our competitiveness, our ability to start up, to grow a business, expand a business, stay here and thrive in California. And then, of course, when we're doing that and our employees are thriving and our incomes are going up, then our communities are better. And so we also spend time being civically active in each of our cities and our counties in the state, and working on seismic retrofit, on our safety and our resiliency through earthquakes and all natural disasters is a key emphasis. And we're grateful to be a part of what you're doing here, Evan, what Ali Sahabi's doing, advancing this need for attention, not wait for the big one to happen next, but lean in and as we did last year, work with the state legislature and the governor to help provide assistance to small businesses, medium-sized businesses who want to make sure their buildings are sound and safe for their employees and their customers. And we look forward to working with you. And you can find us at bizfed.org, bizfed.org. And we also have a BizFed in the Central Valley of California. Looking forward to the conversation. I'm excited to work with Julie on this and everyone here today.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tracy. Yeah, we're going to be talking a little bit today about some recent legislation that BizFed was really instrumental in helping promote, that is going to profoundly affect, in a positive way, small businesses and their ability to remain, to continue to have strong workforce housing after, say, a next large earthquake. So we'll have a little bit of that in a second. Ross Stein, please tell us a little bit about yourself, what about and about Tembler.
Well, I'm an earthquake researcher. I spent 30 years at the USGS and then started Tembler 8 years ago. And our mission is to let the public understand what their own risk is and inspire them to reduce it. And to that end, we have a seismic risk app that works everywhere in the world, mobile app, desktop app, Android and iPhone. And we produce the Tembler Earthquake News, which helps people understand that earthquakes around the world teach us how we need to prepare and become more resilient. Our commercial mission is to help the insurance industry understand the risk that they take in providing earthquake insurance to all of us.
Thank you, Ross. And Ross is going to have some really interesting insights into the Turkey earthquake and, surprisingly, the similarities with potential earthquakes here. And sitting in for Ali Sahabi today with some camera issues is the Optimum Seismic's senior advisor, Tom Robinson. So, Tom, please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about Optimum Seismic.
Thank you, Evan. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning to talk about this subject, which is so very, very important. I've been with Optimum Seismic for about 4 years now, advising them on a whole variety of matters related to their business operations and the educational program that Optimum Seismic has been working with BizFed and many other organizations in California for a number of years now. By trade, I'm a former city manager. Spent 40 years working for cities, and about 25 years of those, I was very much involved in emergency preparedness. So this is a subject that is near and dear to my heart. I feel that our mission is to save lives. It may not be today, it may not be tomorrow, but it will happen. That we will make a difference in our communities. I've also been involved with the USRC, as Evan is aware. I've served as the legislative committee chair for the past year or so, and we've done some very interesting work in that area. And I'm sure that we'll be talking more about that as we go on.
Thank you, Tom. I appreciate all the work that you've done to help advance the goals and the mission of the USRC. So, up until about a week ago, of course, we hadn't planned on talking about this, but I think that we would be remiss if we didn't talk a little bit about the impressions that people are having about the earthquake in Turkey, and of course the immense tragedy that's unfolding there and in Syria. And so I'd just like to get the perspective of our panelists about what their colleagues or constituents or people they've talked to, in the course of their work, have been saying about Turkey. About whether it can happen here, about their own concerns about living in earthquake country. Because I think that Tracy and Julie in particular, of course, represent small businesses in their roles, and I'm very interested to hear how small businesses are thinking about something that's happened 7,000 miles away. So I don't know who wants to start. Maybe Julie, you could give us some of your impressions.
Sure. Thanks, Evan. I think, as happens with a lot of times with disasters, I think a lot of small businesses, most of the owners wear 25 hats at any given point in time. They got a lot of roles, they're juggling a lot of responsibilities, and they all know, like, it is important, right? I do need to pay attention to this. I do need to have a plan. I do need to back up my files, if nothing else. But it takes an incident, in this case, something like the earthquake in Turkey, large scale, that obviously caused a lot of devastation, for them to, like, what, I do need to really focus on this. So sometimes it takes that incident to kind of jolt them into taking a little action. So I think with some of them, it's like, hey, listen, I know sometimes you don't know where to start. You need to do this, but you're not sure where to start. Hey, we've got, webinar series. We've got a lot of resources. So just step one, educate yourself if that's what you need to do. But I think it is kind of that wake up call for them to say, hey, I really do, if I haven't been paying attention to this, I really do need to figure out at least a few things that I could do to protect my business and my people.
Thanks, Julie. I appreciate that. Tracy, how about you? What have you been hearing from your members and constituents?
Well, Evan, obviously it's not just the worldwide tragedy. It was so sad. And I mean, just as we're glued to our TVs and we're watching, the survivors are being pulled out and the miracles that were happening, and just heartbreaking. It comes right here to home. I live in Woodland Hills, and it was within days we had that earthquake that was in Malibu, and in my house, I mean, it was rumbling. It was, I think, a 4.4, but it was just a couple of weeks ago. But I mean, the house was shaking, the windows were rumbling, and it was right on the time of Turkey. So we get reminded about it regularly here, as we have small and medium-sized earthquakes all the time. And literally at that moment, I mean, it jarred me differently, just on the heels of Turkey and seeing just the buildings collapse and the loss of life and the sadness. And then it's rumbling right here. So thankfully, though, we live in California. Thankfully, we have leaders like you, and bringing these webinars and drawing attention chronically and constantly. Because as Julie said, a lot of us employers, we're just trying to get payroll, sell enough business, have enough customers, compete strongly enough so we have enough income to pay our people every Friday, and sometimes these things of making sure the building I'm in is strongly suited. We have the best of the best here. Our architects, our engineers, our planning authorities in all of our cities really know what to do. So on the good side, we do know what to do. It is possible. We have the technology, we have the talent, we have a range of costs. So I'll support what Julie said. It's really being informed, it's understanding, it's caring and paying attention. And then for us who work in advocacy, it's really to make it easily accessible so that the business owners, the building owners, those of us that want to be resilient in every which way and avoid these travesties, can access that information fairly easily. So websites, webinars, the information existing all the time. A lot of the local mayors and as Tom Robinson said, the city managers are really on the front side of this. So you can just make a call, you can get online, you can email, and a lot of information's available. So that's good news.
Thank you, Tracy. Well, that's a good segue to Tom then. Tom, as a former city manager, what have you been hearing, or what do you think is going through the minds of city managers, throughout Southern California now when they're trying to think about their own potential risks? We all know earthquakes are going to happen in California. You just said that in your introduction. What are they thinking?
They're all hoping that it doesn't happen on their watch. And many of them are paying attention to what needs to be done now. There are ordinances that they can adopt. There are programs that they can put in place. There are things that they can do. And the most important thing for them to do is to start, to not put it off, not kick the can down the road or leave it for somebody else, but to start doing the simple things that can be done to organize your community so it's prepared. When I was a city manager, we had monthly luncheons for community groups to talk about emergency preparedness, to hear from experts that were, dealing with getting the people out of the collapsed buildings and those kind of things that we would bring in from around the country. And that kind of education, that kind of involvement makes a difference in whether your community is ready. And I can remember getting up at 3:00 in the morning when the earthquake hit and rolling down to City Hall, and my volunteer teams were already in the parking lot. They were already assembling to operate ham radios and do all those things that can be done. And it's really important. And in terms of the information, I know we've had a 4-fold increase in our website activity over the last week. Okay. People want information. They're seeking it out, and we're seeing them come to our website from around the world. So the information that we all have, we need to continue making that available to people so that they can act.
Thanks, Tom. And so, Ross, coming to you, I'm going to ask you the same question, and then I'll also ask you to kind of roll into this "could it happen here" kind of thing. I know you've got a presentation following our panel discussion, but what are the seismologists and the engineers saying about this? And could the same type of event, the type of intense shaking that we saw there, happen here?
The short answer is yes, but I want to back up and answer your first question, which is how have people reacted? We have 36,000 Twitter followers and about the same number of subscribers, and we're getting an avalanche of questions from them. What about Istanbul? What about LA? What about San Francisco? I think what's happened is over the past 5 years, we've been so focused on wildfires and flood and climate-related changes that people have willed earthquakes away and imagined that they just don't occur anymore because we're now so worried about these very legitimate and very concerning climate-related hazards. And suddenly, this earthquake reminded us that that was a false premise, that earthquakes like this, and this is the same size as the great 1906 earthquake in San Francisco, can strike where we know there are active faults. California is laced with active faults, and we have several others in Utah, Nevada, even Missouri, we have now come back to the understanding that we are vulnerable. Unfortunately, we live in wood buildings and not concrete buildings, and that very much helps us. And there are other benefits so that we will not suffer quite the fate that Turkey has. Nevertheless, this is a reminder. Earthquakes of that size and ferocity have struck here and will strike here.
Thank you, Ross. Yeah, I've been a structural engineer myself for over 30 years and seen firsthand earthquakes locally in San Francisco and Los Angeles, but also in places like Guam. It is sobering to see something in your own backyard, the kind of damage that can occur. And those weren't as large as the earthquake in Turkey. That brings to mind my own discussions I've been having with folks over the past couple weeks about building codes, for example. I get the common question, well, aren't our building codes just so much better than other places in the world? And doesn't that mean our buildings are going to be not only safe, but functional after an earthquake? And the reality is that building codes evolve. We don't have the capacity to, like an iPhone, to test the components a million times to make sure that they're going to work perfectly when the iPhone is produced. Buildings are big things. We can do some testing on shake tables. We can model the behavior of buildings. But, primarily it's really when there is a big earthquake that we get to see how buildings perform. And so our own codes in California, which has some of the strictest codes in the world, have evolved over time. And you'd be surprised to know that it's really only been in the past about 25, 30 years that we consider our codes to be modern, meaning, recognize the true hazards of earthquakes and implement designs to protect them. And in Los Angeles and in San Francisco and probably every other major metropolitan area in the United States, 80 to 90% of buildings were built before the mid-1990s, built before modern codes. And so they have potential vulnerabilities, not enough reinforcing steel, or not good connections between the roofs and the walls, or what you'll hear about a little bit later today, soft story conditions, things that we didn't really know that much about until earthquakes occurred in 1971 and 1989 and 1994 in California, and of course in Turkey, that have taught us lessons about what we've been doing right and what we haven't been doing right. So having to, make people aware that so many of the buildings, and in fact many of the buildings that small businesses rent or own, were built before modern codes and are at significant risk, has been, an eye-opening experience for many people I've spoken with. Just one quick comment before we go on to the next question. You should see a phone number at the bottom of the live chat or the live stream. If you could use that to send to text your questions, that'll be an easier way for us to address those questions and get them. So let me ask a little bit about small businesses and past disasters. Ross has said that we tend to kind of out of sight, out of mind. If an event hasn't happened in a while, we tend to think, well, maybe that's over with, like earthquakes. And yet we have had lots of natural disasters, hurricanes, floods, windstorms, wildfires, and a lot of those have impacted small businesses all around the country. So I'd like to ask Julie, from the SBA's perspective, what lessons can we learn from how other small businesses have fared and responded, both good and bad, in past natural disasters around the country?
Yeah, that's a great point, Evan, that there is a lot to learn from the past disasters that we've weathered. And the small businesses, we at SBA have done, I hesitate to call them success stories because it sounds wrong in this context, but it's essentially the stories, right, of some of these businesses and how they weathered some of the big catastrophic storms, like Hurricane Katrina and Superstorm Sandy and all of those things. And they do like to share their message. And so that is a great way for anybody to learn about what these businesses did. And I will tell you, pretty much the number one thing that they say is like, woulda, shoulda, coulda, right? I should have been better prepared. I should have had a better plan. I'm first and foremost concerned about my people, right? As a small business owner, your people are your lifeline to operating your business as well. And so you want to make sure that they're safe and they have a safe place to live after something happens. And how do you communicate with them, right? Because you might not have cell towers or things might have been impacted by whatever the catastrophic event. So it's having like some of those fundamentals is like what the number one thing that they take away is like, listen, I need a way to communicate with my people. I need to have them kind of understand here's our game plan and maybe here's how we can check in. First and foremost, make sure everybody's safe and okay. And then secondarily, okay, how has the business been impacted and how quickly can I reopen and how quickly can we get supplies? With small businesses, you always find, and this is just one of the many reasons why I love small businesses, is that they're like as worse off as bad as things might be for me, it's worse for others, right? And I want to jump in and help my community too. So they're interested in getting back to operations because they really want to help support their community and anybody that might have been in a worse off position and bring needed supplies or food and whatever necessary essentials. So yes, we have a lot of stories that we can share if people want to take a look at some of the lessons learned and hear directly from these small businesses on what they would do or recommend for their colleagues across the country.
Julie, if there was, and maybe there isn't, but if there was sort of one parameter that was sort of the best measure about whether a small business gets back in business or survives after a major natural hazard, what do you think that might be?
It's really getting them back to operations. So, the longer a business is sitting dormant or not being able to operate, the harder it is for them to bounce back. And so it really is being able to reopen as quickly as possible. And that's one of the things I think businesses need to plan for is whether, different levels of things can happen depending on where you are in the country and different disasters that you might need to prepare for. But really that focus on trying to reopen in some capacity so that you can at least sustain operations for a little bit of time and then hopefully, rebuild. And I know that there are other resources out there that are also looking to help businesses who are open maybe in areas of disaster, but people might not know, right? So that's the other thing is making those connections. And there are partnerships that we've done with like Visa and some others who are able to, in a disaster time, put up maps and show like, hey, these businesses are open and we know they're open because there's credit card swipes, right? So something that is ingenious, something technology related, something information that they have that they can share in a way to say, hey, we know these businesses are open, these are closed, this is where you can go be connected to get resources or supplies or whatever it is you might need.
I hear there's also something called the Waffle House Index, right? That the number of Waffle Houses that are functional is a indicator of how a community has come back after a natural disaster. But yes, I've heard the Visa thing too, because they can tell what companies or what businesses are swiping their visas. Tracy, you've mentioned every time we talk, you mention how interested your member organizations and their member businesses are in resilience. It doesn't seem that anybody's unaware in Southern California that earthquakes are an issue. And so what are the organizations that you represent and maybe some of their small businesses, what kinds of things are they trying to do to make themselves and their communities more resilient?
Well, accessing resources to do something about it is a key thing. That's why we worked with Assemblymember Rodriguez. He's from Pomona and ran the bill. It's it was AB 1721. It was called the California Emergency Services Act. And we got that through last year with a lot of help from all around the state to establish a state fund so that small business could apply and get help to retrofit their buildings. And one thing, Evan, I learned through the process of helping that bill ignite and then educating all the other lawmakers in the Assembly and the Senate. Ultimately, the governor signed it, which we had to educate him too, is that I believe the number is something close to 2.5 million people are in these soft story buildings that is a lot of small business. I mean, small business is everywhere. Small business, every kind of building exists. Small business is there. But there's 2.5 million Californians that live and work in these older buildings that you were talking about, Evan. And so we got this fund passed so that small business could apply for offsetting money to then invest. And maybe they don't own the building. And one thing we're doing is talking to them and helping them be advocates to where they lease from the building owner that owns the property and help them then know this money is there to tap. Now, of course, this year, the state's in a little bit different economic situation, and we want to let everyone know that fund has not been funded in this year's state budget. So now we have to raise our voices, and that's these 410,000 companies that we work with all the time. What we do is help educate them so they can raise their voices to the government officials to let them know what's important to them. And obviously, being able to get some help to help invest in shoring up their buildings. And, sometimes it's putting in a brace. You guys know this better than I do. You asked me what I hear from people, and this is some of what I hear. Is people have like a general idea of what it would take. It makes sense. They went to a webinar, they read about it in the newspaper, they saw it online, and now they want to do something about it. And so that's one thing we're doing. And so you can help us, again, at BizFed, just lean in and we'll help connect you to those that you should say this does matter. And as Julie mentioned too, the small businesses, it's such a big term. And Julie knows from the SBA, we work with her, a small business can be someone with 2 employees, they can have 20 employees, they could have up to 500 employees. And sometimes small business might generate $200,000 a year in total income from their business, or they could do 2 million, get up to 50 million. So we use the term small, but it does have a big, far reaching aspect into our communities.
Yeah, absolutely. Everything from the mom and pop owner of a small apartment building to, companies that, as you say, employ several hundred people and do manufacturing work. I'm glad you raised the topic of this grant funding that was recently made available through AB 1721 with a lot of help from organizations all around the state. I'm going to have to ask Tom a little bit to talk about that a little bit more. But as Tracy said, the U.S. Resiliency Council sponsored the bill, and BizFed was one of its biggest supporters. But there were organizations as diverse as tenants' rights groups and apartment owners. You don't usually see them get along much or come to an agreement on something. Environmental groups and chambers of commerce. And so I did want to talk a little bit about this, Laura. Actually, I'd like to have Tom expand on what Tracy said and talk about the types of buildings, because if you're a small business owner, perk up your ears, because as Tracy hinted at, you may work in one of these buildings. You may lease space. You may own a building that is a soft story. So Tom, could you expand a little bit on what this bill does and the kinds of buildings it will address?
I think the most important thing that people can do is to know what kind of building they're in, okay, and what kind of hazards or threats it poses, because that leads you down the decision trail on different things that you can do. If you're concerned about this issue, do you call your attorney? No, You don't call your attorney. You call a structural engineer. You call a structural engineer to do an assessment of your property and tell you what's right with it and potentially what's wrong with it. There are, as Evan said, 5 different types of buildings. Tracy's mentioned the soft story. Soft story can be residential. It can also be commercial. And we have seen, and Evan or Ross can talk about that a little more, some of the buildings that failed in Turkey were residential buildings on top and commercial buildings on the bottom that had an opening that created a soft story condition where there wasn't adequate support on that side of the building, and it all came down. And we've seen that right here in Los Angeles County with apartment buildings in the Northridge quake. So there's other types of buildings. There's tilt up. There's the non-ductile concrete. That's the concrete that doesn't flex too well. And earthquakes create conditions where buildings need to flex or they need to be strong. And those buildings are weak. And as Evan said earlier, if the buildings have been built before the mid 1990s, they're probably done under older codes that were not as modern and as understanding of the issues as the newer codes. So if you're in a 19 or a 2020 building, you're probably in pretty good shape. And if you've exceeded code, you're probably in pretty good shape. But if you're in an older building that doesn't meet today's codes, you're in for a problem. And you've got some decisions to make, whether you want to try and retrofit a building or do other things to secure it in some fashion, or whether you want to go to another building, whether you want to work with your property owner to have improvements made in your building. And you've always got the little issue that most people aren't aware of, and that's liability. Liability, if you are aware you are in a problem building or own a problem building and you don't take reasonable steps to improve it, and an earthquake happens and the building collapses. In the last case that was heard in the appeals court, the jury awarded $1 million a head for people that were killed in that building, to families, members, and survivors. So it's a really serious question. Call your structural engineering company, have them assess your building, learn what you can do.
Thank you, Tom. Again, I'll just reiterate, having seen in our own backyard in San Francisco and Watsonville and in Southern California, the effects of earthquakes. It's devastating for the population and of course the businesses. I remember, I'm from Northern California, and so Loma Prieta was literally in my backyard, there were so few back in 1989. There were so few engineers available to look at buildings, because it was really just required that the city go look at all the buildings, that some buildings were left uninspected for several weeks or a month or more. A lot of these were small businesses, and some of them, weren't actually heavily damaged. They might have had a crack or two on the outside of the building, but naturally people didn't want to go back in. And by the time the buildings got inspected and were found that they were okay, it was too late. Julie said it. Probably the number one factor is restoring business, restoring functionality of your business. And the small business, probably can't wait a month or two to do that. I think there's some statistic that FEMA puts out that 40% of small businesses that close after a natural disaster don't reopen. And that isn't necessarily because the damage is so heavy. It can also be just because they haven't had somebody tell them that their building can function, or they don't have the resources to get a few things back in order and functioning again. Ross, I know you wanted to comment a little bit as well about this. Please.
So I just wanted to make a simple thought. Imagine a world in which what happens to the crust of the earth is little earthquakes start to occur more and more frequently until finally we have a big one. There are a lot of phenomena that behave just that way. If that were the case, we'd all be prepared. We'd all see it coming. We'd all experience the little earthquakes, the Malibus that Tracy was talking about, and we'd be ready. Nobody would have to convince us to prepare. But instead, we live in the opposite world, where almost without warning, we can have a magnitude 7.8, which is 50,000 times bigger than her Malibu magnitude 4.4 earthquake. And so what we need to do is draw awareness, even sustenance, from the fact that all the time, large earthquakes are occurring around the world. So we have to convince ourselves that they will also happen here. That's tough, but that's our job.
Thanks, Ross. In the next 10 minutes or so, let's talk a little bit about things we can do. Um, a lot of small businesses obviously lease space, right? They don't own the building they're in. And Tracy started to talk a little bit about this, but I'd like to hear from Julie and Tracy what small businesses say who lease space in buildings. Maybe they are in that bottom story of a taller concrete building that has an open front. Maybe they lease a restaurant space, right? And so they have a big window on the front so that people can see into the restaurant. That could be a seismic vulnerability, but they don't own the building. Or maybe they just lease office space in a taller building, or part of a tilt up. Those big box type of stores. Maybe they just lease that. Julie and Tracy, what are some thoughts from you about what small businesses can do if they lease buildings and don't own them? Julie?
Sure. And I think Tom said it best, like, well, first off, know what kind of building you're in. So I think if you have an understanding, and if you're not sure if that building has gone through any retrofit or any other kind of mitigation efforts, it should be a conversation with the landlord to get that information. But I think just because you're in a lease space doesn't mean there aren't things that you can do. Obviously, if your building has room for improvement, you'll want to try to work with your landlord, and hopefully they will take whatever necessary steps they need. But then look within your own space as well. And I am not an engineer, so I will not know all the different solutions for anyone. But there are certainly things you could do within your own space. Consider it a tenant improvement or something similar. And becoming educated, I think, about what are the things that you can do within your own space to protect, whether it's earthquake, if you're in a fire prone area, if you're in a flood prone area, whatever it is, like what steps can you take even within your own space to ensure that you've done what you can to protect your space and then the people that will be within that space.
Thanks, Tracy.
You at the U.S. Resiliency Council, you have such really good practical tidbits all the time. So as Julie was saying, there's things you can do in your own space. It's kind of like fire safety. There's big things and small things you can do to be ready. Same with earthquake preparedness. There are things like just go packs and structural framing, where just the way you do your shelves and store your goods and your products, to how they're bolted to the wall, and your water heaters and things like that, to the bigger things that require the building owner to get involved in, if those are like the steel structures in the parking garage and things like that. So again, remember that the AB 1721 that the U.S. Resiliency Council led the charge on and we got passed, so talk to your landlords. You obviously have lease arrangements, and when you're negotiating your lease renewal, make sure they know that money's available. Ask all those questions when you're doing your lease renewal conversations, as Tom was saying, and then be, a problem solver with them. Don't just put it on the backs of the building owner, but, you're bringing resource intelligence, express that it's important to you to renew your lease, extend your lease, pay increased rates, and that this is vital. And then it will help the property owner also be motivated to work with you on that. But again, don't skip over the things that you can do yourself today within your own premise.
Yeah, thank you, Tracy and Julie. I have heard from property owners, larger property owners, that of course, with people working from home, with downtowns becoming less busy because, of work from home, that, property owners are interested in making in getting people to sign their leases and to extend their leases. And so there may be some leverage that small business leasees have at this point to request those kinds of upgrades, in exchange for, releasing space. So keep that in mind as well, that we may be in a good position as small business owners to negotiate favorable terms. And one thing, we got a question from a viewer about costs and benefits, about sort of return on investment. How costly is it to retrofit, and do I get my money back, and what are the economic justifications for it? And the National Institute of Building Standards did a really important kind of groundbreaking study several years ago, and it's been revised and updated. It's called Mitigation Saves, and you can download that from the NIBS website, nibs.org. And what it shows is that for every dollar invested in hazard mitigation, you get anywhere from $6 to $13 back over the life of the building in terms of reduced economic, property, and social damage by avoiding the damage that comes with natural hazard events. And just to follow up on something that Tracy said, a lot of that benefit comes from the small stuff, from bracing your contents, bracing your shelves, even bracing sprinkler damage is a huge cause of loss in earthquakes, because you break that sprinkler and nobody goes in the building and the place floods, and before you know it, it's a total loss. So sometimes with folks that lease space, there's an opportunity to do some tenant improvements that includes things like sprinkler bracing, better sprinkler bracing, or water bracing, piping bracing in your space. And that can make a huge difference, and that's relatively inexpensive. Adding braces from your main water pipes, sprinkler and domestic water, that can be something that can often be negotiated with the lender or with the building owner, because it doesn't require them to go in and modify the structure per se. So there are a number of documents that FEMA produces on things like non-structural and contents bracing, storage racks, things like that, things that maybe somebody who's leasing a building has a bit more control over. So I definitely echo what Tracy said, is that there are surprisingly a lot of things that somebody who's simply leasing a building can do. So I think our last question for the panel at this point, before we move over to Ross's presentation, is for Julie. And we're going to get into this in future months for sure, the specifics. But I'd like Julie to tease a little bit, because I learned something new just talking with her a couple weeks ago about what kinds of resources are available from the Small Business Administration to help small businesses reduce risk when they own their property. So Julie, why don't you tease what you're going to be talking about in more detail in future events?
Money, right? That all comes down to money and financing. So there are different ways to approach, the issue, and it depends on, where you are. If you own a building, if you're looking to purchase a new building, whether you're leasing, but there are two big ways I think that SBA has programs and services that you might want to tap into. As Evan said, in a future one, we're going to talk more about financing and how you finance mitigation efforts and the ways you might want to leverage some of SBA's loan programs, depending on your scenario, to actually help you build in some mitigation efforts, especially if you're buying a building. If, through our 504 program or something, you might want to, if the building's going to need a earthquake retrofit, for example, and it's another $50,000-$60,000, building that into the loan to help protect your property and lower your risk later on. And I'm sure the lenders would be very interested in protecting that asset as well. So there are things that you can do in that regard. But then on the flip side, I would be remiss if I didn't remind people that we do have a cadre of resource partners out there through our Small Business Development Centers, SCORE, Women Business Centers, and Veteran Business Outreach Centers. So if you're listening to the conversation today and you're like, yes, I do need to take this seriously. I do need to put a plan together. I do need to look at mitigation efforts, but I sure as heck don't know where to start. Know that you don't have to do it alone. You can go to visit one of our resource partners. It will be at no cost to you, and let them help you figure out what your plan and what your path is going to be so that you can protect your business, the assets, and make sure, give everyone peace of mind, your employees, your customers, that you've done what you can.
Thanks, Julie. Yeah, I'm really excited to hear in future episodes about some of the specific loan programs that SBA has. I mean, it's their mission to make sure small businesses thrive in the U.S., and that clearly means after natural hazards as well. We are going to I have one question to answer from the audience, but I know that Tracy has to leave to go to a board meeting. So I wanted to specifically thank Tracy Hernandez from BizFed for all our support, and especially for today, obviously, being part of this panel. Thank you so much, Tracy. We'll be in touch soon. Thank you for all your great advice today. We did get a question from the audience, and so let me answer that. The question is pretty simple. What if my landlord won't tell me what kind of structure my building is? What can I do to find out if the building is potentially safe or potentially vulnerable? It's a great question. It's a great question if you currently lease a building. It's a great question if you're thinking of leasing a building, right? I mean, there are lots of things that you obviously consider, like where is it and how close is it to to people. But that's a great question to ask. So the good news is there's a couple of sources you can go to. First and foremost is the building department from the jurisdiction that your building is in, the building you're thinking of leasing or your leasing is in. Most jurisdictions have a database of basic building information, like when the building was built, and often even the kind of structural material it's built out of, steel or concrete or wood. And that can tell you a lot about potential vulnerabilities of buildings. Buildings primarily built before 1990, or before the early 80s for concrete buildings, in the mid 1990s, and before for steel buildings, subscribe to codes that left a few things out, the things that we have updated since those times. So you can start by going to the jurisdiction where your building is located and ask the building department, for information on that building. It's all publicly available information typically. And the other thing you can do is you can also hire your own structural engineer. Now, they may not be able to go in and evaluate the building. They may not have plans. Obviously, the landlord may not provide them, but they can almost surely tell you the type of building it is. Just by looking from the inside or even around the outside, they can tell you if it's a masonry building or a concrete building, steel or wood. And then knowing the age of the building, again, you can sort of benchmark it. Buildings built before the 1990s generally, are more likely to have certain vulnerabilities. They can also tell you just from the way the building looks. Does it have an open front? Like a soft story. If you're not sure what a soft story means, a structural engineer, even just visually observing the building, can tell you a lot about whether you should start asking more serious questions of your landlord, or consider looking for other spaces. So those are a couple of options for you right there. So, okay, with that, if there are no other current questions from the audience, I am really happy to turn this over to Ross, who's going to talk a little bit about the experience in Turkey, its relation to earthquakes here. And then, of course, if you still have questions, please continue to put them into, text them to the number on your screen, and we'll have a few minutes after Ross's presentation to answer them. So Ross, take it away.
Thank you, Evan. There are things we understand about this earthquake. We understand, and I'll show you, that the magnitude 7.8 earthquake triggered the magnitude 7.5, even though it was 60 miles away and 9 hours later. And we also know that yesterday's magnitude 6.3 was also triggered or promoted by that 7.8. But there are things that are a real surprise here. Both of those big earthquakes nucleated on very minor secondary faults, kind of wannabe faults, that nobody had any idea were capable of starting earthquakes that would grow this large. there are things, and then moving to the building damage, this terrible toll of destruction. There are things about that circumstance we understand and the Turkish engineers understand, and there are things that we need to now get right and think about how they relate to California. So with that, let me share my screen. I have to request to share my screen. Okay, great. Start screen share and window. And here we go. Okay, why should we care about this earthquake in California? And here's the answer. If you don't mind California being put on its side, you can see that the Anatolian Fault system in Turkey and the San Andreas system in California are basically sisters. The faults slip at the same rate, they're the same length, they both have a history of very large earthquakes. So whatever lessons we can learn from Turkey, which has a very long history compared to California, benefit us. And in a sense, we are locked into the same future. So let's take a little closer look at what's going on here that led to high slip rates on these faults. So we have the North Anatolian Fault, which you saw in the previous slide, and the East Anatolian Fault, which is the fault that ruptured in this earthquake. Now, why are these two fault systems here in the first place? It's because Arabia is pushing into Eurasia. And what's called the Anatolian Plate is being squeezed out to the west, where it spills into the Aegean Sea with a bunch of stretch marks, extensional faulting, and ultimately gets shoved underneath Crete. So that's the fate of Anatolia, being squeezed out to the west. And as a result, this East Anatolian Fault is the site of frequent historical earthquakes, and of course, the one we've seen over the last 3 weeks. Now, as you can see here, there are two really large earthquakes. And so what's the relationship between the two? That is one of the most important scientific questions that we need to answer because it's relevant to whatever could happen on the San Andreas system as well. So let me show you a calculation of the stresses imparted by that magnitude 7.8 earthquake. And in this picture here, these red blowtorch zones beyond the end of the rupture are where we've increased the stress. And as you can see, it's where many of the initial aftershocks occurred. But there are also these side lobes that are more yellow-like because the stress increase is smaller. But one of these was the site of the magnitude 7.5. And once that earthquake occurs, it changes the conditions for failure. And now you see this on the right-hand side, the effect of both earthquakes. And whereas before we have kind of a northeast trend of aftershocks, now we have more or less an east-west trend of aftershocks. So that magnitude 7.5 reinvigorated the aftershock process strongly and changed the distribution. And again, these blue areas, which we call stress shadows, are where we expect to have very few aftershocks. The red and yellow areas are where we expect to have more occur. Now, are these kind of calculations relevant to California? You bet they are. So in Southern California in 1992, we had a magnitude 7.3 earthquake. And here are its aftershocks for the first 3 hours. And here's what's happened just a little over 3 hours later. We had a magnitude 6.5 Big Bear shock, far away, 40 kilometers away, on a different fault. And when you think about it, what we saw here in Southern California is a scaled down version of what we just witnessed in Turkey, with two large earthquakes triggered hours apart on different fault systems. Now you might say, well, look, I could almost throw a dart on this map and hit some red or yellow. So prove to me that these stress calculations actually tell us where future earthquakes will occur. And I can, because over the next 7 years, we have 10,000 aftershocks. And the vast majority of those aftershocks occur in these stress trigger zones, including a magnitude 7.1 that occurs 7 years later, and more recently, a magnitude 7.1 that occurred almost 3 decades later. And this tells us that the transfer of stress is how earthquakes converse. And these effects last for minutes and they last for many decades. So with that realization, the phenomena that's going on in Turkey is something we've already experienced in California. Let's go back to Turkey. So here is a more detailed view of the East Anatolian fault system that has that northeast trend. And you can see the epicenters of the magnitude 7.8 and 7.5 earthquake. Now, first you might say, well, wait a minute. Don't scientists tell us that the largest aftershock has to be a full magnitude unit lower than the main shock? The answer is no. There's really no such rule. And in fact, it's easy even to come up with 3 earthquakes in the United States that had, if you like, double main shocks or very large aftershocks. We just looked at one, Landers and Big Bear, but we have others. The Ridgecrest earthquake, the 7.1 I mentioned, it was preceded 30 hours earlier by a 6.4. So there the aftershock was larger than the main shock. So this happens. It's not unique to Turkey. It can happen in California. And we can also say, okay, the East Anatolian fault is 600 kilometers long. It's slipping at about 10 millimeters per year. That's about 1/3 the slip rate of the San Andreas or North Anatolian fault. It still marks it as a major player. So in California, that's the Hayward and Rogers Creek fault that lie in the East Bay. The Calaveras fault farther east. In Southern California, the San Jacinto fault or the Elsinore fault. So in other words, here we have a fault that is not the major player. It's not the San Andreas. It's not the North Anatolian fault. And still, it's knocked off a magnitude 7.8 earthquake. But there's also something else peculiar here, which is that both of these earthquakes have occurred off, or at least nucleated, started off the East Anatolian fault, off that yellow band. They have started on kind of wannabe secondary faults. And that's disturbing, but perhaps not unique. So looking at it in kind of a 3D view here, we have had earthquakes of the same size in Alaska and New Zealand that also did the same thing. And this makes the job of forecasting earthquake occurrence or understanding the likelihood of earthquakes much more difficult. When little mangy faults like this can be the site of the beginning of a great earthquake that later hits and clicks into the East Anatolian fault. It's like that little fault is a kind of a freeway entrance. And if your car can get up enough speed, it can join in on the freeway and then go for a very long ride. Now what I want to do is show you, if we put in the slip that occurred in the magnitude 7.8, what does that do to the rest of the fault? Where is the stress increased and where is it decreased? And like the previous pictures, blue is where it drops and red is where it increases. So where we had a lot of fault slip, things turned blue, that's the good part. But where beyond the ends of the fault and some places in between, we've had places where we've increased the stress. And when we put in that secondary fault on which the 7.5 occurred, we make a discovery. We find that that fault was also brought closer to failure by the 7.8. And so this is something retrospectively that we have confidence in, that the 7.8 loaded the fault that occurred and ruptured in the magnitude 7.8. And once that earthquake occurs, it reloads the fault systems again. So notice now that after we've had both earthquakes, we've added stress, even more stress up to the northeast, and we've added stress on other parts of this secondary fault. So these earthquakes are in a kind of dance with each other, trading off stress back and forth, and that's impacting the toll of aftershocks. And so now let's look at the final earthquake in this picture so far, which is the magnitude 6.3. And you can see that that has also occurred in a region brought closer to failure. Here's another map view of that situation. And now we're showing you all the aftershocks that have occurred in yellow since the first earthquake, the magnitude 7.8 began. And then down here at the bottom is this 6.3 and its aftershocks, all in the red zone. So the good news is we have some ability to tell the public where we would expect aftershocks to occur. The bad news is we don't know how big it's going to be. We don't know when it's going to strike. So you might say, why can't you do more for us? But it's a very, very difficult problem. And the insights that we do have, those are the things we need to bring to the public. And we need to be humble about what we don't understand. Okay, now let's move to the part of this tragedy that we have all been so focused on in the news, which is the enormous amount of damage. Here are 3 cities in which red are essentially collapsed buildings. So huge parts of the urban corridor of major cities have been decimated by this earthquake. And so why is that? And what can we do so that that will never happen again? So out of 172,000 buildings, and this was as of a week ago, so these numbers are definitely higher today, 12,000 collapses, an additional 25,000 buildings that will now need to be demolished. The flip side of that coin is 9 base isolated hospitals, one of the largest hospitals in Turkey. In other words, hospitals built on rubber lead bushings so that they can decouple the motion of the ground from the building itself, have been fully functional. But you can also see where the problems lie. So a principal problem in Turkey is shown by these arrows. One pays real estate taxes on the footprint of your first story. So almost all buildings are narrower in the first story, and then they grow outward for the rest of the stories because that lowers your real estate taxes. And then to recover your investment in the building, you put retail space in the bottom floor, a lot of glass, very little shear support, and now you have a prescription for soft first stories. So you can see it here in the buildings that are still standing, and undoubtedly that was a part of the reason why the buildings that you see here collapsed. Another problem is that to strengthen a concrete building, it takes steel ribbed reinforcing rods, and they have to be densified at the junctions, at the corners between the beams and columns. And an inhabitant of this building doesn't know if they're in there because you can't see inside the concrete. So buildings where the contractors did this in an insufficient amount may not be visible to the people who occupy those buildings. And then, of course, there's a problem that in Turkey, unlike the United States, the inspection, the building code inspection is handled by private companies that can collude with the builders. This is not a purely governmental function. And this has to be changed. But there's another problem that hasn't been widely reported, which is that in many cases, the code was insufficient for the shaking. And this is something that Evan talked about earlier, that codes constantly are upgraded through learning. And in these drawings, the most stringent code is this blue line, and anything in yellow above it is the actual shaking that exceeded the code. And you can see in some cases, it's by factors of 2 or 3. Now, the typical building in Turkey has a resonant frequency of about a half second to a second. So what I want you to do is think about pushing a child on a swing. You know that the longer the swing, the less frequently you push, and you know that to make the child's motion go higher, you have to push when they're going down and forward. If you push any other time, you're actually going to stop their motion. What this means is a building is basically just a child swing upside down, or you can think of a steel ball on a slender rod. If the frequency, the natural period of that building matches the ground motion, then the building shakes harder and harder. And that's in this gray zone here, where, as you can see, in many cases, the actual shaking was 2 or 3 times higher than what the code called for. So the code needs to be revised too. And there may be buildings that met the code that still failed. And this is because a very, very large earthquake in sedimentary basins produces some very, very large shaking. But I would be remiss if I didn't also talk about Turkey's achievements. Turkey has a mandatory nationwide earthquake insurance program. I'm sitting in California where less than 15% of people carry earthquake insurance. Turkey has magnificent seismic and geodetic monitoring, which allows me to give you this talk, which allows us to understand how the earthquakes interact. And they have an outstanding earth science and engineering community. And in solving its problem, the government need go no farther than its own scientists to learn how it should redesign the inspection system, improve the codes, and start building buildings that won't collapse on its occupants. Now, we have to ask ourselves, okay, how do our buildings compare to Turkey's? And we can look at this. This is Tendler's view of what we call building fragility, how fragile buildings are in the presence of shaking. And this is a machine learning kind of big data approach to the problem. And I've just picked out Turkey and California. So in this map, red is bad, blue is good. And as you can see, Turkey is below average and California is way above average. So we are not going to suffer Turkey's fate. I think that can be said quite confidently because we generally have equally strong codes to Turkey, but much, much better enforcement. So what does this mean for this moment in time? It's the moment for requiem, for the terrible human tragedy that this is, and resolve. And resolve not just in Turkey, but worldwide, wherever earthquakes are a threat. We know how to live safely with earthquakes. We have to simply resolve to do it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ross. I really appreciate that. Just your very first slide kind of blew me away when you had California on its side and Turkey, and both faults looking essentially the same. That really struck me because, of course, the Ross. What was the total? What was the total length affected, the rupture length and the length that moved in the Turkey fall? Turkey earthquake.
So it's about 250 kilometers or about 160 miles. That's a little shorter than the great 1906 earthquake in Northern California and about the same as the great 1857 earthquake on the southern San Andreas. So this is the dead ringer for the kind of earthquakes we've already experienced in California.
Yeah, and the fact that they can reach so far. I mean, it can reach from LA to the Central Coast, or the Central California in length. Is pretty astounding. So I want to echo Ross's comment about both the pros and the cons of Turkish construction, and maybe focus in a little bit on this idea of non-ductile concrete. Ross mentioned it in showing you those images of those buildings where several of them were collapsed. Concrete itself is very strong. It's very strong when you push on it, but it has very little bending strength, right? You can stretch it and it breaks because it's like a rock, okay? And that's why we put reinforcing steel inside the concrete, so that when it wants to stretch, the steel can stretch. It's very ductile. And when it wants to push and compress, the concrete takes a strain. And buildings in California built before about 1980 did not have a lot of steel inside the concrete. And so what will happen, and we saw this in the 1971 San Fernando earthquake, and we saw it again in older buildings in both the 1989 Loma Prieta and the 1994 Northridge earthquake, is buildings, particularly at the joints where the beams and columns join, these big X cracks or these big failures where the concrete almost explodes because there isn't enough steel in there to make the thing ductile. And we have tens of thousands of non-ductile concrete buildings in California. I think most of us are familiar with unreinforced masonry buildings. These are the beautiful brick buildings that we see from the 1930s and before. And I think many of us recognize how dangerous they are in earthquakes. But these non-ductile concrete frame buildings, some of which, are 10, 12, 20 stories tall and can house hundreds or thousands of people, are truly among the most dangerous in California because of this tendency for the concrete to be very brittle, to crack and fail. And so, in addition to the work that the USRC is doing to promote the retrofit of soft story apartment buildings, which are primarily wood construction on top of open space, there's really going to be a strong push to make sure that concrete buildings as well find some way to be mitigated, and that when they're designed new today, that they're not only designed to be safe, but also designed to be functional. To go back to what Julie said, it's essential for small businesses to not be out of operations for quite a while, for very long before if they're to survive. I did want to make one comment, or I'll actually ask Tom to make a comment about current bill in the Assembly that actually builds upon the soft story work that's been done, and then maybe ask Ross to make a comment about non-ductile concrete as well. So Tom, why don't you talk a little bit about AB 1505?
Thank you, Evan. Last week, a new bill was introduced in the Assembly by 5 members of the Assembly. It is called AB 1505. That is restoring the funding that was provided by AB 1721 last year. As you may recall, the preliminary budget that was submitted to the legislature in January did not include the $250 million that had been approved and signed by the governor last June. This bill will restore that money immediately. It's an urgency bill to restore that without waiting till next year to begin receiving that money at some point. It would restore it immediately. And that is sponsored by Member Rodriguez and 4 other members of the Assembly.
Ross, did you want to talk a little bit about non-ductile concrete as well?
I just want to tell a story that after the 1999 Izmit earthquake, which was a magnitude 7.6 and took about 25,000 lives, I was going through a factory that was barely standing. And I noticed a huge crack between the beam and the column. And the crack was large enough, I knew I could get my arm in there because I wanted to feel how much concrete reinforcing steel there was and if it was appropriately wrapped. So I got up on a hydraulic lift and I shoved my arm in there and I pulled out a hunk of styrofoam. Styrofoam was in there where we needed steel. And this is why inspection is so important, because you cannot that was a prescription for disaster, and the benefit to the builder of bulking up the contract, the concrete with styrofoam was almost nil, and the results were catastrophic.
A scary story, yes. I think those of us that have been to earthquakes have seen plenty of those kinds of stories. I think we are approaching the end of our 90 minutes, so I want to take this opportunity again to really extend my thanks to Julie Klaus at the Small Business Administration, to Ross Stein with Tembler for that excellent presentation, and to Tom Robinson and Optimum Seismic for their support of the USRC and this effort. As we've said, we have several upcoming webinars, which you'll be made aware of shortly. And some of those will get into the real nitty-gritty details of financing and lending and how to access funds for mitigation and to think about things like liability risk and what are the specific things that you should ask a structural engineer if you have a building and you want to understand the process for understanding if it's vulnerable and then doing something about it. You can always reach out to the U.S. Resiliency Council at our website at www.usrc.org. And I'll ask Julie just really quickly to say how they can how folks can reach out to the SBA with questions.
Thanks, Evan. Yes, everyone, please feel free to reach out to your local SBA district office, whether it's me and my team here in LA or wherever you may join us from the country, around the country. You can find your local resources by going to sba.gov and use the local assistance tool. Type in your zip code and it'll take you to whichever locations are closest for you. So please do reach out. We'd love to hear from you, and we'd love to make sure you're connected with the resources to support you.
Thank you. So thank you again for everybody that's attended. Really appreciate all the great stuff we've learned today, and all of you that have taken the time to listen in. Be available for next month and the following months. There'll be some great information. So with that, I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Thanks.